The man who once crowned himself Emperor of Europe now lay trembling in exile, his body swollen, rotting from the inside, his skin marked with sores, his breath stinking of death. Night after night he woke screaming, haunted by the ghosts of soldiers he had led to slaughter on the lonely windswept island of Saint Helena. Napoleon Bonaparte, the greatest general of his age, was reduced to a pitiful shadow of himself. But how did the conqueror of continents end up dying in such torment far from home, poisoned by betrayal and consumed by pain? Was it fate or was it murder? And what were his final words? Whispers so strange that historians still argue about their meaning 2 centuries later. If you're captivated by history's darkest secrets, don't just watch, subscribe, and be part of the story. The ship cut through the restless waters of the Atlantic, its sails groaning under the weight of wind and destiny. Inside its wooden belly sat a man who once bent the world to his will, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now he was not emperor, not general, not even a citizen. He was a captive. The journey had been long, and the sea air clung to his lungs like chains. Each wave that struck the hull reminded him of his fall, from the golden halls of Paris to this endless stretch of Sultan horizon. When at last the island appeared, it was no jewel of empire. Saint Helena rose from the ocean like a prison carved by nature herself. Jagged cliffs, hostile winds, no safe harbour. A place where no escape was possible, where the sea itself was the jailer. Napoleon, who had once walked freely through Vienna, Moscow, Rome, now set his eyes on this barren rock and realized this was the grave they had chosen for him, though his body still lived. As he stepped onto the shore, the weight of silence was crushing. No crowds, no soldiers cheering, no banners fluttering, only the suspicious gaze of British officers, the hurried notes of clerks, the cold efficiency of men who had once feared him but now treated him like a dangerous animal. The Emperor's boots sank into the wet sand, and for the first time in decades Napoleon Bonaparte felt powerless. The island's air smelled of damp stone and decay, a constant reminder that here his empire was reduced to 4 walls and a leaking roof. It was not simply exile, it was erasure. Europe wanted him forgotten, and the island was the instrument of forgetting. Yet even in this first moment of despair, something flickered in his eyes. A stubborn refusal to die quietly, even as the ocean swallowed his future. Saint Helena was not merely an island. It was a cage built with invisible bars. Every step Napoleon took was shadowed by British guards. Every letter he wrote was inspected. Every visitor screened. Sir Hudson Lowe, the governor of the island, treated him less like a fallen emperor and more like a criminal. Orders were strict. Napoleon was never to leave the island, never to be addressed as emperor, and never to forget that his fate was in British hands. For a man who once decided the destiny of nations, these small humiliations cut deeper than wounds from the battlefield. His household staff were searched, his meals rationed, his movements restricted. Even the landscape mocked him. Longwood House, his assigned residence, was damp, draughty, and infested with rats. The roof leaked during storms, and the furniture was unfit for a man who once dined in palaces. Napoleon, who once commanded golden thrones and velvet halls, was now forced to live among mildew and rotting wood. The surveillance extended to his conversations. Spies listened for any trace of escape plans, though Napoleon had nowhere to run. His every word was weighed, his gestures misinterpreted, his sighs reported back to London. The Emperor, who once silenced Europe with cannons, was now silenced by paperwork. These humiliations were deliberate. The British feared not just his body, but his legend. If Napoleon escaped, even to another corner of Europe, he could reignite revolutions. Better, they thought, to bury him alive on this rock, where the salt air would corrode both his health and his memory. Yet humiliation did not destroy him at once. It simmered inside like a quiet rebellion. Each insult, each indignity became another battle in a war he could not win with soldiers, only with his endurance, the days on Saint. Helena bled into one another, each one a pale reflection of the last. Morning began with the dull routine of inspections and the thin breakfast prepared under the watchful eye of the guards. Napoleon would then walk the grounds of Longwood House, his once brisk stride slowed by the heavy humidity of the island air. The fields stretched wide, but they were bound by cliffs and ocean. His battlefield would reduce to grass and stone. His companions, a handful of loyal officers and servants, tried to preserve fragments of imperial dignity. They addressed him as emperor behind closed doors, despite British orders. They set his table with what silver remained, carried themselves with ceremony. But even this theatre couldn't mask the truth. The grandeur was gone. Instead of commanding thousands, Napoleon now gave orders about the placement of chairs, the trimming of hedges, the arrangement of books, and yet, within these small routines, he waged a different kind of war. He dictated his memoirs, weaving stories of his conquests, reshaping memory into legend. If Europe wanted him forgotten, he wouldn't go quietly. He would leave words sharp enough to outlast the damp winds of Saint Helena. But between these bursts of defiance, silence crept in. The silence of isolation, the silence of a mind haunted by what-ifs. What if he had not invaded Russia? What if he had struck harder at Waterloo? What if France had not betrayed him twice? The once mighty emperor, who thrived on the noise of drums, cannons, and cheering crowds, was left with the slow tick of the clock and the endless roar of the Atlantic. Saint Helena was not simply a prison of stone. It was a mirror, forcing Napoleon to see himself stripped of glory. A man who once held the world, now holding nothing but memory. And as the first months passed, he began to sense a deeper enemy lurking in the shadows of exile, his own failing body. If you had been in Napoleon's place, stripped of power, trapped on a barren rock, haunted by the ghosts of your past, what would you cling to? Survival, revenge, or legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're captivated by this journey into history's darkest corners, don't forget to subscribe. More untold stories are coming. At first it was only whispers of pain, a dull ache in the stomach, a heaviness after meals, the kind of discomfort any man might dismiss. But Napoleon was no ordinary man, and on Saint Helena, his body was the only battlefield left. He confessed to his companions that something gnawed at him inside, a sickness he could not command away with strategy or discipline. The doctors summoned by the British governor were men of their time, limited in knowledge, armed with little more than leeches, powders, and guesswork. They debated endlessly whether his condition was a disorder of the liver, the stomach, or the mind. One prescribed endless bleeding, another insisted on purgatives, a third suggested it was melancholy born of exile. Napoleon, who once calculated the fate of armies in hours, now lay helpless beneath the fumbling hands of physicians who could not even name his enemy. The irony was cruel. This was the man who'd marched through snow, crossed deserts, endured freezing Russian winters and blistering Egyptian suns. His body had survived war, famine, and exhaustion, yet now, in a quiet house on a forgotten island, It was betraying him. Food became both necessity and torment. Each bite brought searing discomfort, as though his stomach itself rejected the exile imposed upon him. The once robust appetite of the emperor shrank to cautious sips of broth, bitter tea, and dry bread. Some whispered of poison, that the British had chosen a slow and deniable execution. Others believed it was hereditary, the same stomach cancer that had claimed his father. Napoleon himself did not know. All he knew was this: his flesh, once a fortress, was crumbling brick by brick. The illness did not strike like a cannonball. It advanced like an enemy army, slow and deliberate, stripping Napoleon of defences piece by piece. His nights were restless, plagued by sweats and shivering. By day he felt the weakness deepen, muscles wasting, skin pale, eyes dulled. His once confident gait became a shuffle, and eventually even walking the grounds of Longwood was an ordeal. He spent more and more time reclined in his chair, wrapped in blankets, dictating memoirs to his faithful companions. His voice, though still sharp, carried fatigue. He spoke of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, his words painting battles brighter than the daylight outside his window. But those around him noticed. He no longer recounted victories with the fiery certainty of command. There was a wistfulness now, a longing in his tone, as though he were already half a ghost revisiting the fields where he once ruled. Memory itself began to betray him. He would lose his thread mid-sentence, stare blankly, then recover with irritation. The mind that once outmanoeuvred Europe faltered under the weight of fever and exhaustion. Sometimes he dreamed aloud, calling for soldiers long dead, whispering orders into the dark. The British, watching from a distance, noted every decline with satisfaction. Governor Low believed the sickness would achieve what no coalition had managed, the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. The island's climate, the poor food, the damp walls, all conspired with his failing body. It was not a prison of chains now, but of blood and bone, and Napoleon knew it. He confessed to his aides, "The English wish me dead, and I am helping them." The great strategist who once bent fate to his will now recognized the truth. The war he fought was unwinnable. By 1820, the emperor's decline was unmistakable. His once broad chest collapsed inward, his hands trembled, his stomach bloated with fluid. His world shrank to a sick room filled with the smell of medicine, damp sheets, and the hushed voices of attendants. The Atlantic winds that rattled the shutters were constant reminders there was no escape, no cavalry coming to his rescue. Napoleon's companions tried to lift his spirits with talk of France, of loyalists still dreaming of his return. Sometimes he humoured them, sketching strategies in the air, speaking of how he would rally the nation once more. But more often he sank into silence, the silence of a man who knew he was losing the last war he would ever fight. Even his defiance faltered. He no longer insisted on being dressed with the dignity of an emperor. His hair grew thin, his uniform hung loose. The man who once embodied relentless energy was now confined to bed, staring at the ceiling as though waiting for judgment. Yet even in this fragility, there was a strange kind of majesty. He endured the pain with the same composure he once showed before enemy fire. Doctors came and went, offering treatments that did nothing but prolong the suffering. The stomach cancer, if that is what it was, advanced beyond their understanding. Each day his voice grew weaker, his breath shorter, his body thinner. Yet in those final weeks he returned again and again to one refrain: France. It was not his illness that consumed him most. but the distance from the land he still called his own. Saint Helena had stripped him of armies, titles, and strength. Now it was stripping him of life itself. The invincible general had become a prisoner inside his own body, and no escape was possible. Do you believe Napoleon's death was the slow hand of nature, or the silent hand of poison? Share your thoughts in the comments below. By 1821, Napoleon's body was a shell of what it once had been. His skin waxen, his voice fading, his strength all but gone. Yet his mind clung stubbornly to life, weaving between memory and desire. Around his bed gathered the few loyal companions who had chosen exile over comfort, men who had once marched beside him in glory, now watching helplessly as their leader slipped further into shadow. In the dimly lit room at Longwood, conversations turned heavy with regret and remembrance. Napoleon spoke of France as though it were a living presence in the room, not an ocean away. He confessed his longing to see the Seine again, to walk the gardens of Malmaison, to breathe the air of his homeland. France, he whispered, I cannot see you, but I carry you here. His thin hand pressed against his chest as if to anchor the thought inside his failing heart. There were confessions too, half-muttered acknowledgments of mistakes. He admitted the Russian campaign had been folly, that his trust in allies had too often been misplaced. Yet even as he recalled failure, his pride remained. I gave Europe a new order, he insisted. They may chain me here, but they cannot chain what I have created. At times delirium overtook him. He would call for armies that no longer existed, issue orders into the silence, or dream aloud of battlefields where victory was still possible. His companions listened in sorrow, knowing that the great emperor was waging his last campaign against time itself, and when clarity returned, he looked at those who remained faithful and said, "Remember me not as I am now, but as I was." In those words he was already crafting the myth he hoped would outlive his body. The night of May 5th, 1821 was heavy with storm winds. Rain lashed against the frail walls of Longwood House, as though nature itself prepared for the passing of an emperor. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of medicines, sweat, and candle smoke. His attendants kept vigil by his bedside, their faces hollowed by sleeplessness. Napoleon lay propped against pillows, his breathing shallow, his gaze flickering between consciousness and oblivion. A crucifix was placed upon his chest. In those final hours he murmured fragments of prayers, fragments of memories, and above all, the name of his son, the King of Rome. His last desire was not empire, not conquest, but the fragile thread of family and bloodline that might carry his legacy forward. Witnesses later recalled the atmosphere with reverence, as though they stood at the threshold of history itself. The wind howled through the shutters, the candle flames trembled, and in that room the silence between breaths grew unbearably long. His lips moved once more, and though voices differ, some claimed his final words were, "France, army, Josephine," 3 ghosts entwined in one farewell. At 5:49 in the evening his chest rose one last time, then fell. The silence that followed was immense, a silence not of peace, but of finality. The attendants wept openly. Even those who had known him as prisoner felt the weight of the moment. The man who had once dominated Europe was gone. The storm outside continued to rage, as if unwilling to let the world slip quietly into the next day. But inside Longwood House, time itself seemed to stop. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the most feared name in Europe, lay still. His war against life at last concluded. Death ended the man, but not the story. If anything, it ignited it. News of Napoleon's passing spread across oceans, whispered first by officers, then carried to Europe like contraband fire. In France, grief and defiance mingled. The monarchy might have restored itself, but the people wept for the man who had risen from obscurity to crown himself emperor. For them, his exile was not a disgrace, but a crucifixion. His death transformed him from a fallen ruler into a martyr of ambition. The British, who had sought to bury him in silence, unwittingly ensured the opposite, by confining him to Saint Helena. They had created a stage where his suffering could be dramatized, his final years painted as a tragedy rather than a punishment, and tragedy more than victory fuels legend. His companions spread his words, his memoirs, his last visions of France. Poets and painters immortalized him, casting the dying emperor as a hero betrayed by kings and fate. His tomb on Saint Helena became a shrine, and years later, when his body was returned to Paris, crowds flooded the streets to honor the man whose name had never truly died. The world had lost Napoleon the man, the strategist, the ruler, the exile, but in his place it gained Napoleon the myth, the eternal general, the romantic exile, the figure who rose higher and fell harder than any before him. His death was not silence. It was an echo, one that still reverberates through history, for in the end Napoleon had achieved what even Saint Helena could not strip from him: immortality. Was Napoleon Bonaparte a tyrant who brought Europe to ruin, or a visionary who reshaped the modern world? Share your thoughts in the comments.